Hi, everyone. My name is Sharon Kornman, and I'm on the board of Voices of Hope. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second program of our 2020 virtual summer series. Voices of Hope is an organization founded by descendants of Holocaust survivors. Our mission is to promote a culture of courage to stand up against hatred through Holocaust and genocide, education, and remembrance. I hope you all enjoyed last week's conversation with Helen Epstein about her mother's recently published World War II memoir, Francie's War, and her many other books about her life as the child of survivors. If you missed it, please watch it on our website, on the Voice of Hope website or Facebook page. Today, we're pleased to welcome award-winning author AJ Sidransky. He has written and published a lot of books and stories, too many to list. Many of them have been nominated for and won awards. I recommend that you check out his website for a complete bibliography. AJ is here today to talk about his latest work, The Interpreter. It was released in March 2020, and it's already been shortlisted by Next Generation Indie Book Awards for an award in the category of historical fiction. You'll be happy to know he's already working on the next book in the Interpreter series. It's going to be called The Intern. AJ lives in New York City with his wife. While he has spent most of his life in New York City, we're happy to know he also spent a few years in our state, Connecticut. Most notably in our household, AJ's son Jake is roommates with my son Jacob at Columbia Law School, and I want to say hello to both Jacobs. Today, AJ will be speaking with Daniela Altamari. Daniela is a reporter for the Hartford Courant, and you've probably read many of her articles. She's also the child of survivors and an active member of our 2G book group. Daniela lives in West Hartford with her husband, also a current reporter, and their 2 daughters. And now I'm handing it over to Daniela and AJ. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Welcome again, everybody. Just one word about the book. It's fantastic for anyone who hasn't read it. It's a real brisk read, a page turner. It's one you can't put down till you finish. AJ, though, I do want to kind of start on a big note here. I guess the elephant in the room. Writing a book about the Holocaust, writing a novel about the Holocaust is controversial. Theodore Adorno said to write a poem after Auschwitz would be barbaric. Elie Wiesel said a novel about Treblinka is neither a novel or about Treblinka. So I'm going to put this question to you as somebody who's written a work of fiction about the Holocaust. Why? Why a novel about the Holocaust?
Thank you, Daniela, and I want to thank all of you for having me tonight and attending tonight. So this is an interesting question, and it's a question I've given a lot of thought to. And the question is why, all right, so first of all, why fiction as opposed to history or biography or memoir? Because fiction serves a different purpose for the reader. When a reader reads fiction, it puts the reader into the head of the character or characters, depending on the point of view. This is a very unique position because it gives the ability to the reader to actually feel the emotions that the character within the story or characters within the story are feeling. So to begin with, it brings the reader closer to the experience. That's not to say that there aren't limits that I believe writers should take when writing about the Holocaust. So you mentioned Elie Wiesel and his quote about Treblinka, which is frankly something I live by. I've written this book, which is about the Holocaust, and my debut novel, Forgiving Maximo Rothman, was also about refugees from the Holocaust. And my position, very simply, is that I never write any scene that happens in a concentration camp. And there's been a lot of controversy, as you mentioned, Daniela, about this subject. There have been a couple of books, and well, it's better not to mention the names, that have come under a lot of scrutiny because they sort of soft-pedaled or sugar-coated the experience of what was going on in a concentration camp. And that's something that I'm very, very opposed to. I feel that if someone has the personal experience and knowledge to understand the Holocaust, if they have a family connection to it, or they've had a lot of exposure to survivors and they've spent a lot of time researching, they can understand the experience of the anguish and the stress that these people lived under. But it's a whole nother experience to actually understand what it feels like to be in a concentration camp. So along that line, Imre Kertész, who is a Hungarian Jewish writer, won a Nobel Prize for one of his books, which is about, it was a fictionalization of his own experience during the war in concentration camps. It was made into a movie some years ago, and my wife and I watched this movie about 2 months ago. And I'd have to tell you that it was really, it was astonishing to see this, and it was very troubling. In this particular case, I think that he had the chops to do this because it was his own experience. But for me, as a writer, and someone who is never been in a concentration camp, nor frankly do I ever want to visit one, I don't feel that it's someplace that I should go. The other issue that's related to this is relative to who's writing the story. So, you know, and I don't want to trash anybody for their research or the work they may or may not have done, but to a great extent, there is a certain level of cultural appropriation involved with writing about the Holocaust for writers who are not Jewish. Now, that's not to say that I don't write about subjects that aren't non-Jewish. I write extensively about the Dominican Republic, but I spend a month every winter for the last 12 years in the Dominican Republic, in the home of my best friend, who's Dominican. I live among them in the barrio. So I've learned the language, I've learned the customs, I've learned the cadence of life in the Dominican Republic. I'm capable of writing about it. No one, Jewish or non-Jewish, who has not experienced a concentration camp has the chops to write this. So my feeling is that if you want to write about the Holocaust and you have a story that should be told, because there are millions and millions of stories that still need to be told, those stories should be told, and the attempt should be made to write it. But one, as a novelist, as a writer of fiction, one has to be very, very careful not to overstep where you're going in terms of what you're writing, because you don't want to cheapen the experience. With that said, one other point on this matter is, you know, novel versus memoir versus historical, you know, a history or a biography. They're very, very different vehicles for a writer. And as I started with the answer to this question, nothing gets the reader closer, not even memoir, because the memoir is a single point of view in the first person. Nothing brings the writer, or the reader rather, closer to the experience than the experience of reading fiction. So for argument's sake, in The Interpreter, you enter the heads of both the victims and the perpetrators, and everyone who else is involved in the story. And it gives the reader a clearer picture of how this horror happened and the effects that it had on the person who was experiencing it. Daniela?
So just a quick follow-up to that, a question that I actually just thought of, you know, this in some ways could have been a memoir that you could have helped, because it was based on, it's rooted in a real person's story. Obviously, you do go further, and you do wind up going into, you know, down other paths as well and into the minds of other characters. But certainly there's a real person at the core of the story. And I'm wondering if you could just talk briefly about, you know, your connection to him, how he felt about the book. I know in the beginning you say that he did not view his story as exceptional, which you know, is probably pretty shocking to most people, because it's an amazing story. But I'm just wondering if you could just briefly tell us a little bit about what that process was like for him in reading this work of fiction based on his life to some degree.
So the first thing I should say is that this story is primarily based on the experience of my cousin's husband, who I consider my cousin, who died a couple of years ago. His name was Kurt Berlin. And he and his parents escaped from Vienna via Belgium to the United States between 1939 and 1941. I think it was 26 months, the entire escape. And the backstory in The Interpreter pretty much mirrors his actual story. A lot of the things that happened were directly from their experience. Now, when I went to interview Kurt about this, and I first brought the subject up with him, he said to me, you can use parts of my story in a book, because I'd already written a couple of novels. He said, but don't write a story about me. He said, my story is not exceptional. And I'm always blown away when I think about this, because his story was exceptional. And this, even more so, the story of his parents was exceptional. That they had the tenacity to be able to escape and to do it in the way that they did, under tremendous tension and stress. I mean, not to give away the story, but for potential readers, they escaped from Europe with holding German diplomatic passports and parading around as Nazis. So it was a tremendously stressful experience for them, tremendous fear every step that they took. The other thing I'd like the audience to understand is that, you know, there's a lot of stories, and sometimes one story is not enough to carry an entire novel. So in this case, what I did was, many years ago, I spent about 30 years in the real estate finance business, and that's a whole nother story. If we have time later, I'll tell it to you. And I had a client many years ago who owned about a half a dozen buildings in Greenwich Village, and he was a very interesting guy. And it turns out that he was born to, his parents were Viennese Jews who were very, very wealthy, who came here around 1920. And he was raised in the German language. And he's actually the model for the main story, which occurs in 1945, as he was fighting in the American Army, and he was approached and enlisted by the OSS to act as an interpreter in the interrogation of captured Nazis. So what I did was I took these two stories and I melded them together, and they knit together very, very well. And then I added certain fictional elements to make the story more compelling for readers. So in particular, the love interest is completely fiction, but it was necessary to get the to get the story to proceed well and to keep the reader interested. So all in all, you know, my feeling is that it was an incredible experience having done this. And, you know, I'm grateful for the fact that I have the opportunity to do it, because I do feel that every story should be told. Daniela?
So you just sort of mentioned one of the threads in the story, and I wanted to kind of pull at that a little bit. Looking at the role of the Americans in this book, you know, it's fascinating and troubling in a lot of ways. Instead of sort of the noble liberators that we've sort of come to view the U.S. military as, you know, after Europe, the soldiers come across as, you know, connivers who are just willing to overlook all these horrific and unspeakable crimes if it would help their geopolitical goal to defeat the communists after the war. And then during the war, you know, we're looking at sort of the U.S. government and its immigration policy and what it forced the characters to do in terms of the numbers game that they had to play and just the tricks they had to pull because they could not get entry into the U.S., which, you know, ultimately would have saved them. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and how you handled that as an American writer, particularly.
All right, let me start with a few different things here. So first of all, in terms of the behavior of the American government, it is an established fact that the American government had several, and from several different directions, both the military and the State Department and what later became the CIA, all had programs that enlisted the former Nazis and gave them American citizenship or protected them in other countries in order to get them to help in the coming fight against communism. You know, there was this very awkward alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States during the war, and as soon as the war was nearing its end, basically all hell broke loose in that relationship. So the American government, which first of all was not a friend of the Jews. I mean, we need to be honest about this, and we need to look at this problem. What really happened in terms of immigration in the 1930s and 40s was that there was, and this went on well past the war, there was a very serious streak of anti-Semitism, in particular in the State Department. They did not want Jews coming to this country. And during the 30s, from 1924 until 1939, which is when the war started, there were real attempts to keep European Jews from easily entering into the United States. I will give you a great example, which is my grandfather's brother, when he did escape from Europe, which was in the fall of 1940. He left Italy, and then they made their way here on a boat by way of Lisbon, and they came to the United States. When they arrived on this boat, they were all refugees with visas to go to the Dominican Republic. They were going to be settlers in a place called Sosua. Yes, you can all read about that in Forgiving Maximo Rothman. When they arrived at Ellis Island, they were not permitted to leave Ellis Island. And the decision that was taken to keep refugees at Ellis Island, specifically Jewish refugees, was because the United States government was afraid that if they entered the general population, they would hide and they would never leave. and they didn't want them here. And sadly, the American Jewish leadership did very little to counter this with the Roosevelt administration, because they were concerned about a rising tide of anti-Semitism if too many Jews entered the United States. So these people did not have much of an opportunity. The laws as they were set, which I do examine this in this book, were set up so that Jews were not viewed as a separate group. They were viewed as part of the national quota from the country they came from. And then, of course, there were the issues of borders. You know, where you were born may have been Austria in 1916, but it may be Poland in 1938. So there were more and more roadblocks were set up. It was very, very hard for Jews to come to this country. So one of the big questions, though, and one of the questions that I pose that I want the reader to think about in terms of what happened after the war is whether or not the American authorities, both military and civilian, especially considering the lack of assistance they gave to refugees in the 1930s, did they not have a responsibility, and did we not have, as a people, a moral responsibility to see that justice was done relative to all of these people who participated willingly, and they all participated willingly. If you know, today we have this expression that's come out of the last 4 weeks, silence is violence. And it's true. If you were silent, you were going along with the policy of the government. So in 1945, didn't the American government have the responsibility to say no, despite the fact that we are now in this coming conflict with the Soviet Union? We don't want you here and we don't need you here. Because how many Jews were not permitted into this country? And how long did some of these Jews who survived the most horrible circumstances ever, the concentration camps, how many of those were not permitted to come to the United States quickly or at all? And how many did not come here and ended up dead in concentration camps? So to me, that's one of the major questions that I examined and what I want the reader to think about, which is, didn't we have this moral responsibility? And what we should keep in mind is that that is balanced against the fact that there was this very serious stream of anti-Semitism that ran through the State Department in particular, and naturally the military. Daniela, is there anything follow-up on that?
There is a follow-up because I think that flows nicely, into one of the things that I was repeatedly struck when reading the book, the parallels with today's political situation. For me, reading this book right now gave your words a sense of urgency and a really a sense of relevance that perhaps it might not have had even a few years ago. For the images of parents being separated from their children and sent over international borders alone. I mean, that's something that certainly resonates in our era. You say right in the introduction that you wrote this book in 2016 with the US presidential election unfolding in real time as you were writing. Can you talk a little bit about how that shaped your story, how that shaped your writing?
Yes, and I'm very glad you asked me that question. So before I answer this question, I want to say to the group that I clearly understand that people have their own political opinions, and that's fine. I'm not here to force my opinion down your throat, so to say, nor am I trying to necessarily change your mind. But what I would like all of you to understand is that I'm going to speak from the heart here, and that as an author in situations like this, I have the bully pulpit, and I feel compelled as someone whose family lost 112 members that we counted and whose names I read every Yom HaShoah in a public service, that I feel it's my responsibility to stand up and say what's right and to be counted. So with that said, let's start with my experience writing this book in 2015/16. So normally when a writer writes historical fiction, most writers do their research prior to starting the book. Now, in past books, I did this, but I was faced with a very unique problem with this particular situation. All right, so I have to take a quick step to the side, which is that you should understand that there are two types of fiction writers. There are outliners and pantsers. Outliners make an outline of the story, and they follow this outline through from the beginning of the book to the end. pantsers have a general idea where the story is going to go, but they don't know where exactly it's going to go. So they sit down and they start to write from the seat of their pants, hence pantsers. I'm a pantser. Kurt, the real Kurt, was 88 years old. He was also not well, and I didn't think I was going to have a lot of time. So I knew that I would have questions for him along the way, and I wanted to get as much of it written before he died as I could. So I would do research in the morning, and I would write in the afternoon. At that time, I was not working, so I was able to knock off this manuscript in a rather quick fashion. Well, the original manuscript, which was 550 pages. Needless to say, you don't get 550 pages published. So I would do research. I even hired a college kid to do some research for me, and he would send me, emails with links. And I would be researching the rise, not that I didn't know a lot about it, but very specifics about the rise of the Nazis and whatnot. Then I would sit down and I would write, and then at about 4 o'clock, I would turn off the TV and I would put on a news program on MSNBC, and they would inevitably be talking about the current occupant of the White House. And inevitably, he would have said, or would have done something that day, or one of his minions would say or do something that was directly mirrored by what I had read that day. It was frightening. It's like they had Hitler's playbook. So it was very disturbing. It was disturbing enough to write this book, but it was very disturbing writing it during this election. And what's both interesting and terrifying about this experience is that now, as I'm writing The Intern, which is set in 1953, during McCarthyism, at the end of the period, is set against the execution of the Rosenbergs in June of 1953. What I've come to realize is that what we now have is McCarthyism too. I'm having exactly the same experience. So it was very disturbing to have this experience and to watch this country descend into the situation that it has descended into. I never worried about my government. I'm 63 years old. I have never thought about the government and that is it moving in the right direction and will it protect me for my entire life until 3.5 years ago. And, that's a very frightening prospect, which brings me to the question of what's going on and how things are mirrored. And specifically, I want to talk about first the kinder transports. So the kinder transports were a very unique program that brought out tens of thousands of Jewish children from Germany and Austria. Most of these kids went directly to England. Some of them went to Belgium, to Brussels, and some to Paris, waiting to go to England until they had sponsors. Now, what is unique about the kinder transport? What's unique is that children were taken and put onto a transport alone. No parents, and maybe they had brothers and sisters, so only children. In the case of the character in my book and the real-life Kurt Berlin, he was an only child. They were put on a train, and they knew that they would, in all likelihood, might never see their parents again. And there were times when one child was accepted for a transport, and the other 3 children in the family weren't. They absolutely did not know if they would see their families again. It was doubtful. Now, many years ago, I was with my cousin, Kurt's wife, whose name is Susan, and I was saying to her, and this goes back about easily 30 years, and I said to her, Susan, I don't understand why our relatives, and they lived in Hungary, why they didn't put the children, my grandparents, nieces, and nephews, onto kinder transports and send them out the way that Kurt was sent out. And she said to me, they didn't have kinder transports in Slovakia and in Hungary. And I said, why? She said, because there's something unique in the German character, the German Jewish character. There's a certain fortitude that they have absorbed culturally from the Germans to be able to do what was necessary to do that. In other words, to stand on a platform and maintain yourself while your child looked at you through a glass window and you knew you might never see your child again. That the Hungarian parents could not do this. That the German parents had culturally had a strength that culturally enabled them to do this. So where does this bring me? It brings me to a very simple point. Right now, because of coronavirus and the economic collapse and Black Lives Matter and police brutality, we're not really focused so much on what happened at the border a couple of years back. But the truth is that when we see children being taken from their parents and they're being put in cages and the parents are being put in separate cages, and if you read my book, you'll understand that Kurt and his parents came out separately. It's a very similar experience. And can we look away? We don't have the right to look away. The bottom line is that nobody makes a 1,000-mile journey on foot with no food and money because they're not really happy with the job they had in El Salvador. These states in Central America are failed states. Their governments don't work. The countries are literally carved up by mobs and gangs and who make these people's lives not only miserable but dangerous. They have no work. They have no future. The women are forced into prostitution. The men are forced into these gangs at a very young age. I mean, 14-year-old girls forced into prostitution. So when they undertake this journey to come here, which to them is the shining city on a hill that Ronald Reagan spoke about so many times, it is simply heartless of us to turn and say, no, we don't have any room. I think one of the things we've learned from the last few months is that without these people, who would have kept the supermarkets open? Who would have delivered our food? So I think as a community, we need to be cognizant of the fact that, yes, there are problems that go along with unbridled immigration, but at the same time, we need to be able to say to ourselves and to our community that we have a responsibility to these people, that they should not be abandoned in the way that so many Jewish refugees were abandoned in the 1930s.
I have a quick follow-up to that, and we can take some reader questions as well. But I'm sorry, viewer questions, readers of the book and viewers.
I hope they'll be readers very soon.
Speaking of that and that responsibility to speak out and the fact that so many were silent or worse when we looked back to the 20s, 30s, and 40s and what happened in Europe, who just turned a blind eye or you know, didn't listen and didn't pay attention. They didn't speak up to save the Jews of Europe then. What responsibility do Jews have now to speak out against injustice, the types of things that you just laid out? Is there a special responsibility that Jews have, or is this just a human responsibility that everybody should be focused on? What's your take on that?
Yes and yes. So it is everyone's responsibility. You know, again, I'm not trying to sell my politics to anyone, but I have to say with all candor that we live in the richest country in the history of the world. We are a nation of immigrants. There are many who would like to believe that somehow they're not immigrants, that they, you know, there's some date stamp on residency in the United States that, you know, after which you're no longer an immigrant. We all come from someplace. You know, one of the interesting things about American culture, and I always like to say this, and I remember telling my son this, you know, Thanksgiving is the most American of all holidays. So every American family has a turkey and stuffing and sweet potatoes and Brussels sprouts pretty much on Thanksgiving. But wherever you go, to whoever's house you go, there will also be something else on the table. And that something else represents where they came from to here. You go, I used to get invited to my friends' homes, Italian people, and they would always have lasagna. My grandparents came from Hungary. There was always stuffed cabbage. I have a friend whose family is of German origin, and there are several different German dishes like red cabbage and spätzle that are on the table at Thanksgiving. And that's the very essence of America. We are all from someplace else. Therefore, we need to welcome these people with open arms. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that there should be, you know, open immigration and we should be overrun by people, because we can as a society handle it. But to take the position that we've got no more room, well, when was the last time you were out to Wyoming? There's plenty of room. There's plenty of need for workers, and these people come here because they want to work. You know, as I mentioned, I go to the Dominican Republic every year, and I live in a neighborhood that has the largest Dominican community in the Dominican diaspora. There's so many Dominicans in Washington Heights that when there's an election in the Dominican Republic, they have voting here for the presidents, for the election there. Now, the Dominicans don't come here to go on the dole. They come here to work. There's no work. There is nothing there. There are some jobs in tourism, and besides tourism, there is no work. And the situation in the last 12 years has become much worse. They cannot work. They want to work. They think if they come here, they can work. And the truth is that I know people who were college professors in the Dominican Republic who came here and drove taxis. So I think everyone has to be aware of this, and everyone has to open their heart. Now, as Jews, we have a very, very sad, but unique but sad history. And we need to be true to that history in the respect that we need to stand up and fight for other people. Now, it's not to say, there's nothing to say that, Jews were not, no one would say that Jews were not involved in the civil rights movement. They certainly were. And we have a history of supporting these causes. But even today, because we can no longer just turn an eye and say it's not me. We have to do this because this is really a reflection on us. There's an expression, pay it forward. We need to pay it forward. It was paid for us at some point, and now we need to help as well. And this extends to everywhere and to everything. It's a matter of doing the right thing. And isn't that really what our faith teaches us? That we want to do the right thing, and that we want to do the right thing in the eyes of God. So with that said, yes, I think it is a responsibility of all Jews in this country to stand up for the right thing. Does that always mean that we're going to agree politically? No, but there are fine shades to this. There's texture to it. But in this one issue, we need to be on the right side of history.
So that kind of flows a little bit into a question by one of our viewers tonight, Angela Epstein. She wants to know why you think some in today's Jewish community are silent, speaking of, standing up and making your voice heard. Some are silent or shy to discuss and be vocal about issues of anti-Semitism. And some are joining forces with groups that are outright anti-Semitic. Just wondering, what your response is to that.
Okay, I'm glad that the person's name again.
I'm sorry, that's a question from Angela Epstein.
Angela, I'm glad that you asked that question. Now, as you do, I share concern that there is a rise in anti-Semitism in this country, and that it is often disguised as anti-Israel feeling. Now, so I've had to contemplate this myself, and very frankly, I went to my rabbi, and I had a long conversation, more than one conversation with her about it, and she's made some very good points about this. And what she says, and I agree with her, is that we need to separate different issues here. One issue is anti-Semitism, straight out. So are there gradations of anti-Semitism? Well, I was once doing a book talk for a large group of men at a men's club in an over 55 community out in Long Island. And I used the term benign anti-Semitism. And there was one guy, the guy couldn't be more than 5 feet tall, jumped out of his chair 10 feet with his hand up like this, screamed at me, "There's no such thing as benign anti-Semitism." Now, is there such a thing as benign anti-Semitism? Not really, but there is certainly a difference between someone who says they don't like Jews and someone who has got a gun and goes into a synagogue and shoots us. So the answer is that we have to be very concerned about anti-Semitism, but real anti-Semitism exists much more on the far right than anywhere else. There are issues with far left groups which are just as bad, and with groups not so far left, where they take positions that appear to us to be anti-Semitic because they are anti-Israel. And what my rabbi has said to me is that in terms of doing the right thing, and I agree with her, said, let's take Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter needs us, and we need them. We need to support Black Lives Matter. At the same time, Black Lives Matter in their so-called manifesto takes a position on the Palestinians. We need to have a conversation with them, and we need to talk about the Palestinians and Israel, and not agree to disagree, but we need to educate them. Because personally, I've had this conversation with many people of color, one of whom is a pastor at a church in Harlem, and another one is a community leader here in Washington Heights, a very influential guy. They refer to him as the mayor of Washington Heights, and he's a featured character in my next book. And in both cases, they were open to the discussion to see the Jewish point of view. The bottom line is that up till now, they didn't have the Jewish point of view. They certainly didn't have the Jewish point of view from the 80% of American Jews who consider themselves secular, liberal, and support the state of Israel. And in both cases, I was able to explain to them our position, and I was able to show them that there are two sides to the story, and I was able to change their view. So is every anti-Semite someone you can convince? No. But there are many cases where it's more ignorance than it is anti-Semitism, at least in my humble opinion. Daniela?
A lot of heavy topics that we've discussed. I have some more questions from the audience, and please keep them coming. But I have a question just to kind of bring us back a little bit to the lighter side of things and root us back in the book. I was reading this book last weekend, and I found myself kept wandering into the kitchen. There were some wonderful descriptions of food and of different meals that people had. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about that briefly, the role that food played in this novel. And then we're going to get back to some of the questions that are more challenging and probably more important than my silly question. But I was just intrigued by that. So.
Well, let me just quickly touch on that. So first of all, if you go to my website, for each novel that you look at the webpage for, there's a list of recipes that relate to the novel. So if you like to cook, be my guest. So what none of you know about me is I'm actually a trained chef. I attended the French Culinary Institute some 25 years ago, and I worked in the catering business for a couple of years. Unfortunately, couldn't make enough money. Back to the real estate business. So food is very important to me, and food is really, for me, food is love. So I wanted to express that love through the book and the characters of the book and how they related to each other. So, you know, food is also memory. And there's this very important scene where, without giving anything away, Kurt, the protagonist, he has a friend from before the war. His name is Saul. It was his best friend. And remember, they were 17 years old. So, you know, it's that 17-year-old kind of friendship, which is pretty important for most men in their lives. And after the war, he's back in Brussels, and he runs into Saul. They find each other again. And Saul has had a pretty hard time of it. He's Jewish, and he's, you know, been in hiding, and you know, he was working on a farm for no money to hide, and he's had a very tough time, and his family has disappeared, and they see each other, and Kurt takes him to a restaurant. And in this scene, I describe a salad that's a very typical salad in French and Belgian cooking, which contains, it's a frisée, it's a salad frisée au lardon, which is frisée is a bitter green, and it's served with bacon lardon and a poached egg. So Kurt, he orders one for himself and for Saul, and as Saul is eating it, he describes how he watches Saul take this on his fork and put it in his mouth, and how he savors this. But he realizes Saul, who grew up in a very Orthodox home, is eating bacon. And he says to him, I guess you're not kosher, you eat bacon now? And Saul says to him, I eat everything now. And there's an important reason why I did this, because it's an important theme in all my work, which is identity. So does Saul's identity change because he now eats bacon? Is he less Jewish? After what he's lived through? Absolutely not. And that's the point of this, that first of all, identity is fluid. We determine who we are. We may be born to something, but we may accept or reject that, or we may enhance it with something else. But at the same time, we get to determine our identity. We're not locked into it. So his identity of as a Jew remains, but his identity as a Jew has changed. Daniela?
So speaking of questions of identity and characterization and how people sort of portray themselves, I'm just wondering, you know, you mentioned Kurt, the central character in the book, has since passed away. I think you mentioned that. But I'm wondering if his wife, Susan, is still alive. And Isabel Kornman sent a question about, you know, what these descendants of the, quote, real characters in the book thought about the book, how they reacted to it. And she also asked if you showed them your work ahead of time and had them review it before publication.
Okay, so the first thing, let me explain. So Susan actually predeceased Kurt. She's been dead several more years than him. And all right, so you should need to, so that you can kind of get an understanding of the relationship. Susan was Susan's mother and my grandfather, my mother's father, were first cousins. So in Europe, in the area where they lived, their mothers were sisters. on their mother's side, and that's mothers in plural, in 1939, there were 66 first cousins. In 1944, there were 6 first cousins alive. So we used to call her my aunt Ilonka, she came here in 1939, and Susan came also in 1939. They were actually on the last boat that left Le Havre on September 1st, 1939, the day the war started. So Susan and my mother were very close. My mother was a bridesmaid she was some years younger than Susan, but she was a bridesmaid in Susan's wedding. And so Susan and Kurt had 3 daughters, and I'm very close to all of them. They're like sisters to me. So I spoke to them before. Susan was already gone when I wrote the book, but after I spoke with Kurt, I spoke at length with all 3 of them, and they all said to me, please, write the book. They also have, between them, 6 children, so there are 6 grandchildren. And when I wrote the first completed readable draft, which was not the first draft, God knows, the first 300 and some odd page draft, I gave them copies and they read it, and then I gave copies to some of the kids and they read it, and they were all very comfortable and frankly very appreciative. Now, what I should tell you is that Susan and Kurt lived in D.C., in Washington, D.C., and he was a very successful attorney and she was an artist. And they were among the original benefactors of the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. So part of the proceeds of my royalties from this book will be donated annually to in their honor to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They responded very well. They understood that this was a fictionalized account. But 2 interesting points to that was that, first of all, Kurt had never told his entire story to any of the 3 of them. Each one had a little bit, but none of them had the whole story, kind of like the way my grandmother gave a recipe. And at the same time, I also incorporated a couple of parts of Susan's story into this because it worked. And I was able to knit it together. And so there's parts of both of their stories in this story. But the reception has been tremendous. And I should also say very honestly that this book would not have happened without the tremendous support and encouragement and help that I got from the Jewish Book Council in New York. And I urge all of you, if you have reading groups, the Jewish Book Council has a book club program. There's 1,800 book club members, and they have guides. I have a book club guide on the JBC site. It's downloadable and it's free, and you should use them as a resource for your book club. So yeah, my cousins were very, very happy about this. As a matter of fact, one of them, the youngest, Cindy, last Tuesday, I did a book talk with her book group.
That's great. I want to return to some of the big themes that the book raises about responsibility and speaking out and using your voice. This is a question from Emma Fairberg. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Besides marching and protesting, what are some actionable things that people can do to help those whose voices aren't as strong and loud as ours? What types of things that, looking at what folks did after the Shoah to look at, how we can sort of learn from what happened when people didn't speak out. What can we do now in our everyday lives?
Okay, I want to say 2 things about that. The first thing I want to say is that one of the things that I've learned, and this is like really critically important for us to know and to acknowledge, and really to use as an example, is that particularly in terms of people who escaped as refugees, and the Berlins are a great example, they needed to have 3 components to their success. The first was a bit of luck. The second was a bit of money. And the third was the help of a Gentile. No one escaped without help. So when we keep that in mind, we need to respond the same way in terms of trying to help people in this country today who do not have our voice and who need our support. So what does that mean? And I'm really glad that you asked that question, Emma, because I've had this conversation with my friends here who are involved directly in the protests and in the movement. What they don't want is don't call them and tell them, how bad you feel and, you understand that you have white privilege. How can you stop that? You have to be proactive. Call your congresspeople. Call your political representatives and say, this is what has to happen. Call out bigotry and racism when you see it. Be aware of our own systemic racism. We all have bigotries. I have bigotries too. I'm the first one to admit it. But we have to be aware of it and we have to stop it. And we have to understand without telling people of color that we are aware of how fortunate we have been because of white privilege. The bottom line is that this has helped me. And I could give you all, we don't have enough time for me to give you all the stories that I could give you about this subject. You know, suffice to say that I really learned what white privilege is when I went one night. My best friend, as I mentioned, is Dominican, and he is very dark-skinned. And his daughter, who's the same age as my son, had just started college. He worked 7 days a week as a bicycle mechanic. He needed to bring some stuff up to her. She was 4.5 hours away in upstate New York, and he had to go at night. He was tired. He needed another driver. Asked me to go with him. Long story short, we were stopped by a cop on the New York Thruway, and that was the moment when I learned what white privilege is. So A, be aware that you do have that privilege, and B, use your political connections and money. Donate money to help and be vocal. And, you know, I hate to say this, but keep in mind, we have an election coming up. And the way for us to stop this and to help to stop this is to vote the right way. You know, I know there are people here who support Trump. I understand, but what I'm going to ask you is to get past the issue of Trump's pandering to Israel. There's no other word for it. I'm going to ask you to get past that and understand that we, as my grandfather said to me, you live in this country. We need to vote for what happens in this country. And again, I have the bully pulpit, so I can do this, and anyone who leaves because of it, I understand. But at the same time, the answer to your question is be proactive. Donate money, support them, tell your politicians that you want this kind of legislation passed, and if necessary, go out to the protest yourself, but wear a mask. Please keep that in mind. And if you're fragile, like, listen, I have diabetes, I can't go to these protests. There's no way, because I could catch this. So that's what you can do to help. And it's important. And I hope nobody's offended by what I've said.
Can you talk a little bit about your connection to the Dominican Republic and how that might play a role in some of your work? Small roles perhaps in this novel, perhaps bigger roles in future works. But I wonder if you could talk about that a little.
So, okay, first of all, the Dominican Republic. I write a lot about the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic was an important factor in my family's history. My grandfather was one of 9 children. Only 2 children survived the war. My grandfather, because he was here, and one uncle, his name was Max Grunfeld, and he escaped from Nazi Europe, and he went to the Dominican Republic, where he settled in a place called Sosua, which was a settlement where 850 European Jews, most of them German, Austrian, Czech, and Hungarian, escaped from Nazi Europe. They survived there. So some of you who have been to the DR may know of this place. You may have read about it. My debut novel, Forgiving Maxima Rothman, is partially set in Sosua. So how I became sort of more involved in the Dominican community was that we moved 17 years ago from the west side of Manhattan, the Upper West Side, which contains 5% of the Jewish population of the United States. We moved up to Washington Heights, which contains this enormous Dominican community. And as we lived here, I made friends in the Dominican community, mostly men I met at the gym. And as a result, I started traveling to the DR, and I found this place that is so unique, and I fell in love with it. And I kind of really understood my uncle a lot better, because my uncle never wanted to leave the DR, but my aunt didn't want to stay there. My grandfather was badgering him to come here. So I kind of quickly understood why he fell in love with the place and what life could be like living there. So actually my next book, which is titled Forgiving Stephen Redmond, which is the 3rd piece in the Forgiving series, is also placed partially in, part of it takes place in the DR, and a lot of it takes place in the 1960s in the Dominican community here in Washington Heights, and sort of wraps up the last of the loose ends that were left by Forgiving Maxima Rothman. If you have some interest in that, you can read about that on my website, and you can also, if you want just something quick to read, you can check out the short story page where there are a couple of stories that feature the detectives, Kurchenko and Gonzalez, who are the stars of all the Forgiving books, Forgiving Mariela Camacho, Forgiving Stephen Redmond, and of course, Forgiving Maximo Rothman. So that's my connection to the DR.
Sorry, there's somebody mowing their lawn. I'm in my backyard, so I apologize for the background noise. Just want to ask you a little bit about your writing process. You talked about that a little bit when you described sort of how you delve into these novels, but when you actually sit down and write, do you have stacks of research? Where are you? Are you in an office? Are you at home? What's your actual sort of the logistics of your writing process?
I live in a 5-room apartment in Washington Heights, and the apartment has a very large living room. One end of the living room is set up as a desk and sort of like a little study, and that's where I do my writing. I've written 5 novels there, and I'm very comfortable working there. When I wrote, actually, when I was working on Maximo Rothman and Mariela Camacho, there was a Dominican restaurant around the corner where I used to go for lunch, and they used to have Dominican music playing, and they would have fantastic food. For $5, you got a whole lunch. And I used to in the afternoon, I would take my computer and go sit there for a couple hours. Unfortunately, the place closed. Now it's a Korean grocery, so where I can't go to write. So my writing process is that I sit down and I just write. It kind of just comes out of me. If I were not a writer, people would think that I was insane because I have voices in my head. And the voices actually tell me the story. So as I mentioned, some people are outliners and they just know what's coming. With me, I get to know the characters as I'm writing them. And, in some instances, like the Forgiving series, it's a lot of the same characters. So they keep coming back to me, which is great. And then when you finish the book, it's a little sad because it's like losing a friend. And, you're not going to be seeing these people every day anymore. So that's kind of the process for me. It's very cathartic. And I find that there's a certain feeling I get when I'm done writing that, for the day. And I can write, sometimes 3 hours, no problem. I will tell you, it's interesting, when you're writing particularly violent material, though, there's a limit. The best example would be Forgiving Mariela Camacho, which involves a serial killer. And the serial killer's chapters are written in the first person. I could not write his character for more than about 45 minutes at a time because the material was so crazy and sick, and I would say to myself, that came out of you, and so, I'd have to stop. But generally, I like to write in the morning, now more than before, and so it depends. I try to have to work it in around. I have a job with a magazine where I do all kinds of things. It's a real estate magazine, and so I fill it in as I can. I also like to go out to the garden. The building has a garden, so when the weather's nice, I'll go down there to write too. Because I'm the only one, 54 units. I'm the only person who uses the garden. I have not yet figured this out after 17 years. So with that said, I'd like to just, before I go to the final thing, I just would like to say thank you all for attending. And I would like to tell you how you can help me. So I know this is a little mercenary, but the way you can help me is buy my book and read my book and tell people about my book. And if you belong to a book club, invite me to talk to your book club or to your synagogue or your community center or your organization. But one very important rule, if you buy my book, you tell other people to read my book, do not lend my book to anybody, because that's one less book sold. With that said, Daniela, I turn it back to you.
That's great. We had one more question, which sort of relates a little bit to what you were talking about before in terms of process. And this is again from Isabel Kornman. This book is a travelogue in some ways, a lot of interesting cities and places where the characters are living. Did you personally travel to the cities that you wrote about? And if not, how did you sort of create the very sort of vivid images, the descriptions of the train stations and the buildings and all the things that you take readers, all the places you take readers to?
Okay, that's a great question. So the answer is that I have been to most of the cities that were in this book. I've been to Vienna, Brussels, Paris. The cities I've never been to Lyon. The way that you do this is, first of all, I understood the cities because I'd been there. And when I go to someplace, I like to travel around and I use the subway, and I like to get the feeling of being there, and I like to stay there as long as I can. But the wonderful thing with historical fiction is the internet. The internet is like having an encyclopedia and every picture ever taken in the palm of your hand. So if you want to know So the question was, what train station would they be going out of in Vienna to go to Brussels? Well, it's very easy to find that out. You Google that, literally, and then you look at a picture of the train station. So I had actually been in Westbahnhof station, so I knew, but it's still a good example. I call up the picture, and then from that, I am able to write the description. You can't really make it up. I mean, there are some things that you can make up, and then if I can just take a couple of minutes, I know we're getting close to the end, but historical fiction doesn't mean that everything has to be exactly as it was. There are some things you can fudge and some things you can't. But I have an interesting story about that. So for argument's sake, in Forgiving Maximo Rothman, when the settlers arrived in the Dominican Republic, they actually arrived in the capital, which is on the south shore, and they had to travel overland by lorry to where Sosua was on the north shore, and it took several days. That didn't fit into the story. So I simply landed them in Puerto Plata, which was 20 miles away from Sosua. You can do that. That's acceptable. What you can't do is you can't change the date that World War II started. So on that note, years ago, Herman Wouk, very big Jewish author, Herman Wouk writes a book called War and Remembrance. And it's this long 2-volume tome on, historical fiction on the lives of these families during World War II. And one of these families was a Jewish family in Poland. So he places the scene on September 1st when the Germans invade Poland. He wants the family to be in a synagogue praying when the bombs begin to drop on this town, which is on the border of Germany, then Germany and Poland. So he has them in the synagogue praying for Rosh Hashanah, because, praying on Rosh Hashanah, because it's the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So for 40 years, I was under the impression that the first day of Rosh Hashanah fell on September 1st, 1939. Okay, as my grandmother used to say, mittendrin, I have a scene in this book that involves Rosh Hashanah in 1939, 1940, whatever, 1939. And I don't know what possessed me, but I checked it. And it turns out it was not September 1st. Rosh Hashanah was September 15th. So the answer is, if you're Herman Wouk, you can change history, but I can't.
Well, that's great. We covered a lot of big topics and we covered a lot of fun topics too. So I really appreciate it.
One other thing I forgot to mention, I think if you guys go on the chat, you might find the link to the Amazon page if you're interested in buying my book. And it's in both e-copy, you can buy e-copy or you can buy paper copy. So I'm sorry, Danielle, to interrupt you. Please go on.
No, I just wanted to thank you. I think we're right at 8 p.m. And this has been really enlightening and a lot of fun and a lot of things to think about. So hopefully everybody enjoyed it. And thank you for listening. And thank you very much, Alan.
One last thing. I want to shout out to my oldest friend, Tom Ianta, who's here all the way from California. Tommy, I'll call you in a little while. Bye.
Hi.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Karen. Thank everybody.
I want to close this out. You know what? It says Isabel Kornman under my name, and in fact, that's because I used her link. I'm Sharon. I just want to close out by thanking Alan for spending time with us today to talk about his latest book, The Interpreter. I read it, and then I passed it on to Daniela. Sorry. It really is a good book. You'll read it. It's like 2 days. You won't want to put it down. You'll read it, at night, and then you'll be done, and you'll want to talk about it. I hope one of my book groups reads it. I said to Alan, it should be a movie. I'm waiting for a movie. It's very cinematic.
We do a whole nother session on it.
Yeah, when you make a movie, we'll do it. All right. I also want to thank Daniela for helping us out and asking some really good questions. Next week, and thank everybody again for showing up for part 2 of our summer series. Next week, we will look forward to our program, same time, June 30th on Tuesday, and we're partnering with the Jewish Hartford European Roots Project. We have Professor Samuel Kassow of Trinity College, and he's going to be speaking about Yiddish culture in wartime Europe. We hope you'll join us. I think you can register through the Voices of Hope website or through the Facebook page, same as tonight. Finally, I want to encourage everyone to check out Voices of Hope's website and Facebook page, and you can see everything that our organization is doing and has done to fulfill our mission of promoting education about the Holocaust and genocides. If you like today's program, we encourage you to make a donation of any amount through the Voices of Hope website, which is ctvoicesofhope.org, so we can continue to bring these kinds of programs. And thank you all for joining us. Good night.